So now what we're going to cover is what I call my top 10 tips. In the previous 2 videos, we talked about the range of emotions and the amount of silence. There's many, many more ways in which we communicate differently depending on where we are around the world, that can create cultural differences, issues when we work with culturally different people. And I don't want to go through all of them. What I want to encourage the viewers, particularly to understand these differences and to read books or talk to other people about these topics. But what I want to do here is give you suggestions that will work no matter what difference you're going to deal with. So in other words, these top 10 tips will work no matter where the other person you're working with is coming from, no matter where you come from, whether it's a cultural difference, gender difference, generational difference, and so on. These tips will apply to any form of difference. Tip number 1, awareness is 50% of the solution. When you realize that what you're dealing with is a cultural difference as opposed to a personality difference, you will handle it differently because you're less likely to take the behavior of the other person personally. If you know that that's the way they were brought up, then obviously you realize that they don't doing it specially for you, they do it to everyone. And that's the idea. So awareness is 50% of the solution. Now, as my wife puts it, the other 50% is a lot of work because it implies changing habits. And if any of you has tried to change his or her own habits, you know how difficult that can be. Patience is a virtue. When we work with people who are different from us, particularly at the beginning, it takes more time. This is a part which is fundamental for everybody to realize, okay? Now, with practice, with training, we can decrease the additional amount of time needed initially when we work with people who are different from us. But there will always be initial misunderstandings around, communication and so on. Very important in my experience is to remember this. Communication is not just about sending messages. You need to ensure that the message that is received is the message that was meant to be sent. That goes both ways. When you send a message, when you receive a message. By sending a message, I'm talking about any form of outbound communication. So whether you send a text, an email, you leave a voicemail, you say something in person to someone, you write it down in a document, doesn't matter. It's all you're sending a message. In that situation, remember that what the person understood may not be what you meant. So in particular, monitor the impact you have on people. And if the impact you have is not the impact you want to have, stop and clarify. There will be times when what you said has been misinterpreted and the person will respond in a way which is very different than that you expected. Well, it's important to realize to stop at that point and clarify. Okay? When you receive messages, you don't know what the person meant, you only know what you understood. So what I want to encourage every viewer to do is remember this. When you feel offended, annoyed, impatient, frustrated, or disrespected, treat these feelings as red flags that you may have misunderstood what the person meant to tell you. How do we deal with it concretely? Well, first, we need to notice that we are reacting negatively. So how do we do that? Well, monitor your own emotions. So you notice when you react negatively. In other words, you start feeling annoyed, impatient, disrespected, or angry. Okay? So notice your own emotions, so you notice when you react negatively. When you react negatively, don't act on these feelings. Instead, try to understand where does the feeling come from. What was the word, the gesture, the tone of voice, the action that triggered that negative emotion in you. When you've isolated the trigger, then the question becomes, well, what does that trigger mean to the other person? All right? So It's not easy to do in real time, but my experience is try it, because even if you do it only 50% of the time, it will make a world of difference. Let me illustrate this with a few concrete examples. So one trigger, okay, by trigger I mean a word, gesture, tone of voice that means a different things to the sender and the receiver, is this gesture. For the average Canadian, this means 2 peace of victory, okay? And the average Canadian does not differentiate between this and this. In the UK, there's a huge difference between this and this, okay? In the UK, this will mean peace, victory, or 2, and this will mean up yours, if you'll excuse my language, okay? My British friends have told me this is twice as bad as this. So, a very common misunderstanding is when Canadians go to a pub in the UK, it's a very noisy place, they want to order 2 beers, and they will gesture like this. And sometimes they will they'll end up with 1 beer in their face. So this gesture means a very different thing to the sender and the receiver. This is what I mean by a trigger. So how do we manage that? Remember to separate impact from intention. And the idea, now it's not easy to do, but even if you do it only 50% of the time, it will make a world of difference. I will end these top tips with this one. The golden rule needs to be replaced by the platinum rule. Golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. Platinum rule, treat people the way they want to be treated. Why the difference? Well, what works for you may not work for them. So in the workplace, where we've seen a lot of issues are when people try to be helpful or respectful. Because behaviors that are helpful to one group are unhelpful to others. Behaviors that are respectful in one group can be disrespectful in another group. So if I go back to the example of the way I was brought up in France is, well, I'm going to kiss ladies on the cheeks when I greet them as a way of greeting. That behavior is respectful in France, but it is considered very disrespectful in Canada and many other countries. So this is a very important point in my experience. Most people want to be respectful and consider respect to be universal. In practice, respect has a cultural component in the sense that the behaviors that imply respect will depend on where you are in the world. So I'd like everyone to remember that what works for you may not work for other people.